The science of near-death studies is undeniable and irrefutable, as explained by Dr. Jeffrey Long.
Dr. Long, in 2010, you published Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences. New York Times bestseller, a game changer really for science because the evidence you presented was very straightforward and very compelling. Your conclusion, by every way we can look at it, consciousness seems to survive death for these people who have experienced a near-death experience. But I still get emails all the time from people who don't know that. For example, you investigated people who were blind from birth, and the first and only time they ever regained sight was during a near-death experience, or that you published a medical survey with thousands of participants, or that when you asked them to verify their near-death experience, 96% of them went and verified it and were able to verify that. So can we start there? Can we recap a little bit about that evidence that you uncovered and published in that first book?
I've been collecting data now for over 17 years. All the way back in 1998, the Near Death Experience Research Foundation website came up. Immediately from the day it came up, we had a very detailed survey asking the near-death experiencers a great many questions so that we could learn not only from a large number of near-death experiencers, but learn in depth by drilling down, if you will, to learn with many, many questions exactly what happened during their near-death experience. This is by far the largest near-death experience study that has ever been conducted. And that's exciting, and that's important because that allows us to have more confidence than ever in these groundbreaking conclusions that we'll be talking about today.
Great. And let me add to that with a question about NDE research and this study that you're talking about. So let's let people know, first of all, that you are a full-time radiation oncologist, a cancer doctor. You work for a hospital there in Houma, Louisiana, outside of New Orleans, but you're also a scientist and a medical researcher, someone who, beyond your full-time job, had an interest in this and was able to approach it in a scientific way, like true medical research. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. My medical practice, which I practice full-time, is radiation oncology, which is the use of radiation to treat cancer. I have a very busy full-time practice here in Houma, Louisiana, which is about an hour outside of New Orleans. But in addition to being exceptionally busy in my professional practice, if you will, my second full-time job is doing that near-death experience research. And I've been taking that research very, very seriously, just like I would professional medical research that I do. My professional curriculum vitae is 7 pages long. I've done a lot of research over the years. I take it very, very seriously, and I understand the things that you need to think about, the meticulousness, and the importance of doing it right. So I brought all that skill set into my experience on the research that I did on near-death experience, and that led to with the conclusions I got from the evidence. It was based on the best scientific and medical investigative techniques that we could possibly find for doing this type of research.
And the research that came out of that, I thought, was just stunning. For example, I mentioned briefly a minute ago that you found people that were blind from birth, and yet the first and only time they ever experienced sight was during their near-death experience. You found from a physician, this was really important to you, but you found that people were having near-death experiences during anesthesia, during heavy anesthesia that was unexplainable. Can you recap some of the most surprising to you as a physician results that came out of that initial research that you did and published in the book, Evidence of the Afterlife?
Sure. I think everybody's got their favorite near-death experience accounts, but perhaps among my most favorite of all time was Vicky. Vicky was born totally blind, and in those born totally blind, vision is unknown and unknowable, and you can't explain vision to somebody born blind in terms of the remaining 4 senses. I tried it, it's impossible. Vicky was a professional singer, and she was being driven home one day after a performance, and there was a very serious auto accident. So serious indeed that she nearly died. The first time Vicky saw herself was when she had her near-death experience. Her consciousness separated from her body, and from her vantage point above her body, she saw herself laying on the gurney below. She didn't know that was her. She was horrified, actually, was her first emotional sense, because vision was so unknown to her for entire life. But it was after she calmed down a little bit and correlated the feel of her long hair, and interestingly, she could feel a ring that a father had given her all her life, and now, for the first time in her life, she was seeing it, and only when she correlated with her newfound sense of vision did she understand that that was her down there. Vicki went on to have an amazingly detailed, highly visual near-death experience. In fact, she described vision in the way many near-death experiencers do, and that's what's called 360-degree vision. That means she can simultaneously see in front of her, back of her, right, left, and up and down. Technically, it's spherical vision, and she was able to simultaneously process that. We've had many, many other near-death experience accounts that describe that exact same thing. Interestingly, talking to Vicki later, she assumed everybody on the planet had spherical vision like she experienced, because remember, she'd never known vision in any other way. And to this day, I think she has a hard time grasping how the rest of us have sort of a pie-shaped visual field and don't really see things the way she did that one time, that one amazing time during the near-death experience that she had.
So great. And let's pack that back into the broader results that you have, because that's one account. And one of the things you'll hear from people who are not very open to the near-death experience science, the kind of stuff that you do, is they want to pick apart cases and say, gee, that's an anecdote and that's just one case. What I think you've done, and maybe you want to explain, because you did say you do this meticulous research, for a medical survey, you're asking 150 questions. You're correlating. There's questions that are duplicate to see if they answer it the same way. There's other little tricks that you do. You're reviewing it as a medical professional to see if it's real. So you have in these surveys kind of two aspects of it. One, data that you can correlate like a good medical scientist would. And then you have these narrative descriptions, which are super powerful and important. But tell us how you use both of those tools to kind of come to your conclusions.
Well, again, being very meticulous and cautious in my research, one of the first things you have to do is make sure that the experience is valid. We ask many questions in our 150 question survey in a redundant fashion. That means basically the same question worded slightly differently at a different part of the survey. That way we can match up the responses and make sure that they line up, that they're sharing the same responses to the same basic question. Second, very important thing when I review near-death experiences, I'm a physician. I've done this now thousands of times. For me, it's relatively easy to see if the life-threatening event that they described and the medical treatment they got, the subsequent medical recovery from that close brush with death, does that really add up medically? And it's very easy for me to make that determination, again, because as a physician, that's my bread and butter. So those are sort of the reality checks that we do on each and every near-death experience to make sure that when we post it on the website, when we use it in our research, we can be crystal clear from very careful inspection that, yes, this is a near-death experience. It really happened.
So, Dr. Long, let me probe a little bit further about the types of near-death experience research that's out there, because over the years, I've interviewed a lot of near-death experience researchers. And for example, just the other day, I interviewed this guy, nice enough guy, University of California. He's doing his postdoctorate fellowship. He's part of a team. They receive $4 million Templeton Foundation to study near-death experiences. So I speak to him about his research. Turns out he didn't really do any original research. He didn't go into a hospital, into a cardiac arrest ward and talk to patients there. He didn't, as you did, develop a 150 medical survey and give it to hundreds of near-death experience researchers. Yet he published his results. We talked about his book. He concluded that near-death experiences aren't real in the way that we're talking about. They don't suggest that consciousness seems to survive bodily death. So I guess the question is, for the average person who's trying to sort through this idea of near-death experience science, research, How do they sort through it? How do they know what research really holds up out there?
The key thing is to know a few of the consistently seen elements of near-death experience that are the strongest evidence for their reality. For example, when you're under general anesthesia, it should be impossible to have a lucid, organized remembrance at that time. In fact, under anesthesia, you're typically so far under. With general anesthesia, they often have to breathe for you. I mean, you're literally brain shut down to the level of the brainstem. And at that point in time, some people have a cardiac arrest. Their heart stops. And of course, that's very well documented. They monitor people very carefully that are having general anesthesia. So I have dozens and dozens of near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia. And at this time, it should be, if you will, doubly impossible to have a conscious remembrance. And yet they do have near-death experiences at this time, and they're typical near-death experiences. They have the same elements and appear to have them in the same order as near-death experiences occurring under all other circumstances. And in fact, a critical survey question I asked was what their level of consciousness and alertness during the experience was. Well, even under general anesthetics, under those powerful chemicals to produce sedation, if they had a near-death experience under general anesthesia, their level of consciousness and alertness was identical to near-death experiences occurring under all other circumstances. There's absolutely no way the skeptics can explain that away. It's impossible. That in and of itself is some of the strongest single line of evidence that near-death experiences have to be independent of brain functioning. There's simply no way you can be under general anesthesia and have a highly lucid, organized experience like that, and especially one that's consistently seen throughout near-death experience research. So that's probably the strongest line of evidence we have that the physical brain, as we know it, simply cannot produce the near-death experience.
Okay, and I'm going to push that a little bit further because here's where I was trying to lead you, really, because this has come up over and over again with me, Jeff. I'm not making this up. You know it because you see it out there. I mean, here's a book with all these academic credentials, and you dig into it, and they never spoke with a near-death experience, someone who actually had a near-death experience. I've had this happen over and over again. I can think of 3 or 4 in the last year where I've interviewed them, and I just want to scream and go, how is this near-death experience research? There's no people who had a near-death experience.
That is an amazingly good point. It is astounding to me, too, that we have people that publish, write books, write scholarly papers about near-death experience that have literally never talked to someone who had a near-death experience. That is some of the most bizarre research I can possibly imagine. It makes no sense to me, and I'm sure everybody that sees this video is going to think, gosh, how is that even possible? How can somebody claim that they're doing near-death experience research and never, ever even talk to someone who had a near-death experience? Well, the answer is you can't. If you're going to investigate near-death experiences, you have to talk to the near-death experiencers, and you have to understand what happened during the near-death experience. You have to look at the evidence, as I've published, for their lines of evidence that all converge on the validity. That's what really matters in assessing the reality of near-death experience, not the hypotheses that these other researchers generate about how near-death experiences might occur. That's ridiculous. What really matters is, here's what happens during a near-death experience. Here's the evidence for the reality. Can you refute that evidence or not? And with regard to the skeptics trying to refute the evidence for the reality of near-death experiences, they haven't come close. They simply cannot explain away all of the lines of evidence that for near-death experience that me and so many other near-death experience researchers so consistently see.